In the popular narrative of the colonization of the Americas, the native peoples are unilaterally depicted as victims, struggling bravely yet hopelessly against the tide of civilization. Historically, however, this was not the case. And when looking for examples where Native Americans consistently and decisively beat back the colonial advance, one need only look at the Comanches. In pure martial skill, the Comanches were simply unmatched. The deadliest mounted warriors ever to fight on the American continent, they possessed a cultural mindset akin to the ancient Spartans, and a lethality in war akin to the Mongol horde of Genghis Khan. Today, we will explore how these peerless braves of the southern grasslands became the most powerful tribe in the American West, triumphed over the mightiest colonial powers of the 18th century, and forged the most powerful indigenous empire in the Western Hemisphere. Welcome to our video on the Comanches, the Horselords of the Southern Plains.
Every week we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons. The Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job.
The Comanches were not native to the Great Plains of Texas, in which they created their empire. They were initially an offshoot of the northern Shoshone people of Sacagawea fame, and lived in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains around what is now Wyoming and Utah. In the pre-Columbian era, there were no horses in North America. Thus, the Shoshones were originally a pedestrian people, wandering their mountainous homeland as small bands of foot-bound hunter-gatherers, preying on deer in the forests and salmon in the rivers. This sustainable, if humble, lifestyle came under intense strain in the 17th century, during the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling which compelled many Shoshone to migrate for the warmer, flatter regions to their south and east. By the middle of the 1600s, a new branch of Eastern Shoshones were well established in the northern part of the Great Plains, between the Platte and Missouri rivers. Adapting to their new environment, the Eastern Shoshones changed their lifestyle, shaping their diet, economy, and culture around the endless and seemingly undepletable hordes of buffalo that roamed the grasslands, using dog-pulled sleighs called travois to transport their belongings as they followed and hunted the bison on foot. Suffice to say, this was a highly time-intensive and hazardous way to take on massive hordes of 2,000-pound horned monsters capable of running at up to 35 miles an hour. Soon, however, indigenous lifeways on the Great Plains would change forever, with the arrival of another four-legged beast. When the Spanish arrived in the New World, they brought with them many things that changed the landscape of the Western Hemisphere forever, from guns to Jesus to devastating old-world diseases. Most of these advents wreaked havoc upon the indigenous societies they encountered, but one thing the Iberians reintroduced to the Americas after 10,000 years of absence would greatly empower native peoples, and that was the horse. For plains people like the Lakota, Cheyenne, Blackfoot, and Shoshone, the horse changed everything. It was a miracle beast that could carry 4 times as much weight as a large dog could move, and it could cover at least twice the distance in a day. Atop its back, bison hunters could search for prey over a wider range, and instead of tediously sneaking up on the buffalo and driving them off cliffs, as they had before, they could simply ride the monsters down. In almost an instant, the world became smaller and its resources more accessible. Throughout the 18th century, the life of the pedestrian tribe was revolutionized, as various indigenous nations rapidly evolved into mounted, well-equipped, and powerful peoples. During this time of transition, a subgroup of Shoshones left the main contingent of their people and embarked on a long southwards migration into what is now the state of Texas. The southern plains also had bison herds in abundance, but more importantly, it was closer to the Spanish colony of New Mexico, which was at the time the center of the American horse trade. These migrants knew that the Mustang was the key to power, and that to control the flow of horse flesh was to become the masters of the land. Not long after their arrival in the south, these newcomers became the overlords of the region, subjugating all the local tribes and seizing control of the horse trade. Within 2 generations, they had transformed from people who had never seen a horse to an entirely horseback society. In the process, they developed a new identity, separate from their Shoshone parent tribe. They called themselves Narmen, meaning the people, but they became better known to their new neighbors by a title derived from a Ute word meaning enemy, Comanche. The American South was by no means a vacant place when the Comanches arrived on the scene in the early 1700s. The Spanish had re-established the settlements in Texas and New Mexico along the Rio Grande River. The French were present in nearby Louisiana and the lower Mississippi Valley, and various other mounted native nations were following the herds of bison and horses into the southern grasslands, much like the Comanche were. Of all these regional players, the Comanche would prove to be the most brutally efficient at establishing their supremacy. The first victim of their expansion were the Plains Apaches. Although a brave and martial people in their own right, they could not stand against the relentless Comanche assault. By 1740, the majority of Apache had been killed, enslaved, or driven off the plains and forced south to the Rio Grande. Many other tribes on the southern plains suffered a similar fate, or were rendered into junior partners in the Comanche alliance. The Comanches made war on white men with muskets just as readily as they made war on Indians. Raids into the viceroyalty of New Spain began in the 1720s and continued relentlessly in the ensuing decades. Comanche war parties ravaged the colonial settlements of Texas and New Mexico with relative impunity, carrying off thousands of cattle, horses, and slaves. Reinforcement armies sent from Mexico City were defeated by well-armed Comanche warriors, who were faster than the Spanish, could fight better on horseback than the Spanish, and used guerrilla warfare tactics that the Spanish were unable to adjust to. Entire communities fled in fear as new Mexican settlements vanished from the map. By 1780, only the capital of Santa Fe remained untouched, but the city was overflowing with refugees. At the peak of their imperial hubris, the Bourbon Crown of Spain claimed North American territories as far north as Alaska. The Comanches would ensure that they would never make it further north than Texas. All of this begets the question: how exactly did the Comanches dominate both the Spaniards and rival native nations? After all, their enemies also had horses, weapons, and military customs. Author of Americana S.C. Gwynn answers this question by drawing parallels between the Comanches and the ancient Spartans. Much like the Spartans, the Comanches were the only society of full-time warriors in their time and region. They did not cultivate corn, weave baskets, or make pottery like other tribes did, for their society was completely stripped down to the hunting of bison and fighting of men. Other indigenous nations could ride and could fight, but the Comanches simply did it better, for it was all they ever did. This harsh Spartiate culture, which thrived on the great grasslands of Texas, produced a nation of people where every single military-aged male was a fully trained, deadly, and professional soldier. If the cultural mentality of the Comanche was akin to the Spartans, their fighting style was more aligned with the Mongols. The Comanches were horse archers par excellence. Wielding asage orangewood shortbows adorned with turkey feathers and horsehair, they were capable of loosing a dozen arrows in the time it took a white man to load a musket and fire off one shot. Beyond bows, the Comanches also wielded long lances and buffalo hide shields, which one Texas ranger once claimed were tough enough to deflect bullets. Capable of riding circles around their foes, trying to fight the Comanches was like trying to catch wind in a net. Comanche raids were brutal, with victims being scalped, mutilated, or enslaved. There was no taboo on violence against women and children, and no taboo against torture. Like many cultures before and after them, the Comanches wielded fear as a weapon, and their reputation for brutality made it so that many would rather flee or give up their valuables rather than put up a fight against them. With that said, the image of the Comanche as a one-dimensional killer is an incomplete one. The empire they built in the heart of Texas was, at its core, a trade empire. Leveraging their position of dominance in the center of the American landmass, the Comanches established or tapped into long-ranging trading networks, which spanned the breadth of the continent. They forged strategic alliances with the Kiowas, Utes, and Wichitas, and other indigenous nations which served as liaisons between them and European powers like the French, English, and even the Spanish, who they traded with as often as they attacked. Commerce was essential to the Comanches, for other than raiding, it was the best way for them to obtain vegetables and grains to supplement their bison-heavy diet. Trade with the Europeans resulted in the Comanche acquiring an abundance of firearms. In return, the Comanches traded in bison meat, furs, and most lucratively of all, in horses, a commodity which they dominated. Moreover, the Comanches were highly active in the regional slave trade. Natives, mestizos, black peoples, and white peoples alike were seized in Comanche raids. Indigenous captives were sold in Spanish slave markets in New Mexico, while white captives were bartered off to allied tribes or assimilated into the Comanches themselves. It is important to note that the Comanches were never a politically unified people. At the height of their power, as many as 13 different Comanche bands roamed the southern plains. Consequently, the Comanche Empire was not an empire in the traditional European sense, but more akin to the great nomadic confederations like the Scythians, Sarmatians, or Gokturks, which dominated the Eurasian steppe before the rise of the Mongols. Like these peoples, the Comanches often fought amongst themselves, but were also capable of unifying to make war on the settled civilizations on their frontiers. Each Comanche band had a peace chief and a war chief, who earned their positions through meritorious conduct and could be removed and replaced whenever the band lost confidence in them. Compared to their Euro-American counterparts, women in Comanche society enjoyed far more freedom and autonomy. Unlike European colonial society, the Comanches had no conception of racial stratification. Throughout their history, the Comanches adopted European outcasts, escaped black slaves, Mexicans, and indigenous peoples of other tribes into their nation. Anyone could be a Comanche. Inversely, anyone could be enslaved. At the dawn of the 19th century, the Comanche Empire was at the zenith of its power, but the world around it had begun to change. The European colonial empires which had dominated the American landmass for centuries had begun to recede, replaced by their revolutionary successor states in Mexico and the United States of America. When the Mexican Revolution broke out in 1810, Comanche warbands took advantage of the chaos and launched an upsurge of raids into the colonial settlements in Texas and New Mexico, hastening the collapse of Spanish power in the region. When the first Mexican Empire emerged as an independent nation in 1821, it did so battered, broken, and impoverished from a decade of war. At first, Mexico achieved an alliance with the Comanches, seeing them as a useful buffer state that could prevent the encroachment of the westward expanding United States into the Texas territory she had inherited from the Viceroyalty of New Spain. However, this partnership quickly fell apart after the economically destitute Mexico failed to live up to the trade obligations within the treaty. The Comanches lashed out with a spree of devastating raids which carried off thousands of cattle, horses, and slaves back into Comancheria. They forged war trails over 1,000 miles long, raided within a 3 days' ride of the capital of Mexico City, and rendered northern Mexico into a wasteland. While Mexico had initially intended to use the Comanches as a buffer against America, it now, ironically, had no choice but to seek out Americans as a buffer against the relentless and merciless Comanches. In 1824, the Mexican government opened Texas to foreign immigration, inviting thousands of Anglo-Americans to settle in the region, with the promise of generous land grants and tax exemptions. This scheme backfired on Mexico spectacularly. In a long story made short, the new settlers turned on their Mexican hosts. General Santa Anna had an epic gamer moment at the Alamo, and in 1836 the Republic of Texas was born. Any hope for peaceful coexistence between the Comanches and the new white Texans was dead on arrival. As Texas settlers expanded their farms and ranches into Comancheria, the Comanches struck back. In the famous raid on Fort Parker in 1836, several white settlers were killed and 5 taken captive, including a 9-year-old girl named Cynthia Ann Parker, who would be adopted by her captors and spend the next 24 years living as a Comanche. For the better part of a decade, white Texans living on the frontier of their new republic lived in fear of the Comanche moon. But the Comanche also finally met their match in the form of the Texas Rangers, a mounted militia formed to fight off Comanche raids. The Rangers were armed with a revolutionary new weapon, the Colt revolver, the first commercial firearm capable of matching the firing rate of Comanche bows. As that immortal phrase of Americana goes, God created men, but Samuel Colt made them equal. In 1845, the citizens of the Republic of Texas celebrated as their independent nation became the 28th state of the United States of America. Mexico protested violently, having not relinquished their claim on the territory, but the Mexican-American War of 1846 permanently settled the matter. When the United States Army crossed the Rio Grande in 1846, the soldiers who marched through what are today Mexico's northern states encountered a region which was desolated, depopulated, and barely defended. This destruction was the work of the Comanches, whose devastation of the Mexican frontier, ironically, paved the way for a United States victory that doubled Washington's territory and put the Comanches in their direct crosshairs. Almost immediately, the United States picked up where the Texas Republic left off. America wanted to manifest its destiny from sea to shining sea, and the Comanches were simply in the way. Naturally, the Horselords of the Southern Plains objected to this assessment, with a spree of brutal and deadly raids against American settlements on the Texas frontier. The most famous Comanche chief to resist American expansion during these years was himself half American. His name was Quanah Parker, and he was the biracial son of Cynthia Ann Parker, the girl who had been taken captive by the Comanches some 20 years earlier. Yet despite their stubborn resistance against American encroachment, the Comanches' battle was a losing one. The revolvers and the repeating rifles that Comanche braves now faced were a different breed of firearm than the cumbersome muskets their fathers and grandfathers had outrun and outshot when they ravaged the Spanish and Mexicans. However, it would not be through strength of arms that America brought about the end of Comanche independence. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, linking the Atlantic coast to the Pacific and transferring settlers westward faster than ever before. The white population in the southern plains skyrocketed, while the Comanches continued to dwindle. Back in 1862, a devastating smallpox epidemic had torn through Comancheria. Diseases brought to the New World by the white man had ravaged the indigenous peoples of the plains for centuries, but now it hit the Comanches harder than ever before, reducing their population from a high of 40,000 down to 5,000 and decreasing. Much like many other indigenous nations in the Americas, germs, not guns, would be the Comanches' downfall. A horse and a bow cannot defeat disease, nor can it defeat starvation, and systematic starvation was precisely the tool that Uncle Sam used to finish off the native nations of the Great Plains. Their target was the Plains people's primary food source, the buffalo. What followed was the greatest mass destruction of warm-blooded animals in human history. White men with repeating carbines culled the buffalo with brutal efficiency, leaving seas of bovine corpses to rot in the field. In Kansas alone, the bones of 31 million buffalo were sold for fertilizer between 1868 and 1881. Within a single generation, A species whose massive herds had once blanketed the wild grasslands had been brought to the brink of extinction. And with the death of the bison, so too did the empire of the Comanche come to an end. In 1874, Chief Quanah Parker led his band of Comanches in one final war against the United States government. His was the last free band of the Nomadic, the others having already surrendered and been marched off to reservations in Oklahoma. Quanah and his braves fought fiercely, but they were defeated. In the summer of 1875, he marched into Fort Sill and surrendered, leading his warriors to join his interned brethren in Oklahoma. So it was that Comancheria came to its final end, and the great wild plains where the Comanche once roamed were turned into the farms, ranches, and plantations of the Americans who came to replace them. With that said, the Comanche are not a people consigned to history. They still exist today as a federally recognized tribe with over 17,000 enrolled members, largely concentrated in the state of Oklahoma. Their empire no longer exists, but their traditions and sense of identity survives, and with it, the memory of Comancheria lives on. More videos on Native American history are on the way, so make sure you have subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video. To watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.